What's going on YouTube? Kronos here, and welcome back to the PSO2 video. So, this video is going to be a little weird. Now, those of you guys who watch over on Twitch probably know that I've already done this before. So, let's explain. Over on Twitch, I had a goal for a certain number of sub points overall. When we reached that number of sub points, I joked around like, oh, I'll make a class tier list, because tier lists was something we were talking about with other games, how tier lists affect the community, so on and so forth. I'll talk about it in just a second. But we're kind of just joking around about tier lists, and we figured, you know what? We'll make a tier list if we reach a certain goal. Didn't really think anyone was going to reach that goal. They did, so gotta make good on my promise. Made a tier list on stream. It was a little bit meme heavy. We had a good time, but I thought I'd share the tier list with you guys over on YouTube. You're probably wondering, well, why not just take the recording you took from stream? Well, to be honest, I went back and looked at it. I don't like the way that I put together my thoughts at that point in time. I want to put it a little bit more concise, because I did put a lot of thought into how I decided to rank the classes themselves and why I decided to put certain classes in certain spots. And it was a little bit more meme heavy over on Twitch, just because we joke around, we have a good time, that sort of thing. So I figured it'd be a bit better to come back to it really quick, redo the video itself, and I don't want to say put more information, but make the information a bit more concise. So first and foremost, tier lists are inherently kind of a meme itself. Before we go into anything, I will say every class on this list is playable. Some will joke about playable, haha, very funny, but no, everything is playable to a certain degree. Everything can clear content, maybe not the same content, maybe not with every weapon, maybe not with every class combination, but everything is playable. Balance isn't super terrible compared to some games that I've played where certain classes are just not even touched. You basically will find almost a little bit of everything if you look around hard enough. So how am I ranking these classes? Well, main class usability, subclass usability, overall damage, and use in a group. Solos do kind of count as well, just because, I mean, they kind of just fit into the whole main class usability and damage perspective. But I'll talk about each one of them as I go across to them, or as I go to them. So let's just jump right into this. Let's get this one out of the way. I don't think anyone's surprised about this one here. Luster goes in S rank. Luster is not out on global yet. It will be out fairly soon. It's been out on JP for quite some time. It is a very powerful class that not only is powerful as a main class, it's powerful as a subclass. It offered some pretty interesting subclass choices for a lot of other classes, making those classes more powerful. It took an entire weapon that wasn't really used and brought it up substantially in its damage, and has made it one of the best weapons for, funny enough, for Tech or Luster. So that's where I bring Luster straight up to S tier, no questions asked. If you were to ask me what the best class in the entire game was completely, I'd probably tell you Luster pretty easily. So what comes up afterwards? Well, that one's easy for me. Phantom. So why Phantom? Well, Phantom, again, a lot is kind of similar to Luster in the fact that it brought interesting subclass options when it was released. Now, granted, it wasn't across the entire board. It didn't, bring up the entire use of a single weapon. But the class on its own is very powerful. Granted, 2 out of 3 of its weapons are really, really useful. The third one is a little bit memed on, unfortunately. Sorry, Katana users. It's not a Phantom. Does need a bit of love. But as a class in itself, it is carried pretty heavily by its counter-based playstyle. The advantage is awesome. The only thing I would say that it's lacking, and the reason why I put it behind Luster specifically, is well, its damage compared to Luster is, it can be very, very high, almost in some cases being higher depending upon the content you're doing. But its survivability does lack a little bit compared to Luster, where Luster has access to its, what most players will call its will, its one-shot protection, every single time it gets its voltage over 500. Phantom has just pensed, which I'm sure if my Phantom players out there know that if you deal with any bit of ping, sometimes you can just get absolutely destroyed through just pensed. So it's not really always that reliable. That, and as a subclass, it doesn't really have access to it either. So it doesn't even offer you survivability as a subclass. So for that, it puts it behind Luster in my book. So where am I going to put Hero? Now, Hero is an interesting option. So this is one of the first silent classes that released. Now, because of this, it didn't have use as a subclass, so it is going to be hurt because of that reason. And Hero's a bit more matchup dependent. So Hero for me goes in A tier. Now, Hero is a very strong class. Played correctly, it can output crazy amounts of damage. However, there are two things that are very important to that. One, you have to use all of Hero's weapons to output that crazy amounts of damage. It's not just one single weapon that you can just crutch. All weapons you have to use. So something to keep in mind. Granted, it's not really that big of a deal. It has PAs that push you into each weapon itself, so weapon swapping, which is really, really cool. And if you watch if you watch a really good hero play, it looks super stylish and it's actually pretty cool to watch. But it brings us to our second issue with hero, which is it is match up dependent, meaning that if your target isn't hyper aggressive, isn't on you specifically, like if the target's not targeting you, you're losing damage from not being able to counter and step through abilities. That's kind of something hero really, really, really wants as much as possible, to the point where it even has a skill on its actual skill tree that allows it to gather a bit more threat. So for that reason, hero gets moved down to A tier. So I'm just gonna put this here. Now that's not saying that I'm making Etwal Z tier. I'm just gonna put it here and save it for last because I have a little bit more to say about this one. And those of you guys who watched who are watching over on Twitch know. So what are we gonna do with the rest of these classes? So let's take Hunter. Hunter's actually not a terrible class. It's a little slow at first, but it actually gets fairly quick once you get used to it. And it was before all the silent classes were released, it was hands down the best subclass in the game. It was used by the most classes. It offered basically just stuff across the board. It was really, really useful. So where does that put Hunter for me? Well, Hunter actually goes into B tier for a few reasons. Where Hunter is carried by its subclass usability, by the fact that some of its actual class combinations are very, very powerful. It's really hurt by the fact that one of its best weapons is currently still bugged. I don't know why, but Partisan's Volgraptor, one of its main mechanics as the weapon goes, still just randomly disappears. I've seen some really, really good players play really, really well and just lose Volgraptor and lose a bunch of damage for no reason. That and Wired Lance is still a little bit odd to play. Granted, if you play it enough, it does end up playing very well and can do a lot of damage, like a crazy amount of damage actually. But it is very niche. I mean, a lot of people really don't play the weapon itself. It's not really all that fun in a lot of content, and it can be a bit of a pain with Hunter's strongest setup. Hunter's strongest setup being guard stance, basically. Sometimes Wired Lance can be a bit of a pain to set that up consistently compared to something like Partisan or Sword. So for that, it puts it in the B tier for me. Fighter. Now, have you asked me this question a few months ago, I would have told you Fighter was like D tier, probably closest to Z tier possibly could be. Fighter was very much damage, but at the cost of almost all of your survivability. You took things like Hunter because you basically didn't want to die, and you needed to be close to death to be able to keep up with everyone else. It was kind of crazy. However, Fighter did get a buff recently, a pretty massive one. Originally, we thought that it was going to shift the weapon meta around. However, they still buffed Double Saber along with everything else. So just brought everything up, really, which was kind of cool to see. So for me, Fighter moves into A tier. Now, Fighter does still have that issue where you are still living very close to the edge. However, at least now it feels like it's a bit more worth it. You are still dealing crazy amounts of damage. Fighter does still have usability as a subclass for classes before they unlock things like Phantom, just because it has multipliers for tech that Hunter didn't have access to, so it does bring it up a little bit more in that situation. And Fighter just does a crazy amount of damage. Let's tack on something like, well, commonly right now it's commonly beforehand, I'm sorry, it was Hunter that Fighter used as a subclass just because of survivability purposes. Commonly right now you're going to see something like Etwal. Very soon you'll see Luster as a subclass for Hunter, for Fighter, and it just does a crazy amount of damage. So for me, that puts Fighter into A tier. So Ranger actually took a bit of a hit. So Weak Bullet was nerfed a while back. Now, granted, if you only played Global, you really have only played with nerfed Weak Bullet, so you don't really know. But Weak Bullet was much stronger than it was beforehand. So Weak Bullet took a pretty big hit overall to its damage. And also the headshot multipliers, I believe, also took a nerf to their damage as well, which did hurt Ranger's damage quite a bit. Granted, Ranger was shredding before. However, enemies were a bit slower, and headshot multipliers were a bit higher. So because of that, Ranger goes into C tier. Now, you're probably thinking, what? Ranger offers really great support with Weak Bullet, where it does, yes, its support isn't always enough, or actually isn't really enough in my opinion, to balance out all of the negatives that it has to deal with. Fast enemies completely like just they zoom past Ranger, and it's really, really annoying. A lot of their abilities require them to sit still, and not so much cast, but shoot and things of that sort, which hurts Ranger itself. Again, keep in mind we're also thinking about party play as well as subclass usability. And Ranger it's not used as a subclass anywhere. You're really not going to bother with Ranger for anything at all, really. So for that, it does push Ranger down to C tier. It doesn't mean it's bad. It does do really good damage. It can do really good damage. It just has a lot of things working against it, which kind of sucks. Gunner. Well, Gunner's in a bit of a weird spot. So because Gunner, when its level 85 skill came out, ended up having to be rebalanced, it pushed its damage down a little bit. Now, if you weren't aware, when Gunner's 85 skill came out, its Esral Arts cleave ability that it got access to, it was really, really strong. Like to the point where you just didn't use Photon Arts at all. You basically just used Esral Arts in the cleave and then Chain Trigger. And whenever your Chain Trigger was built up high enough, you just burst Chain Trigger. The problem with it is now, I mean, granted, they rebalanced it. PAs are much stronger. You're not reliant on that consistently. The issue is Chain Trigger is still kind of a pain in the butt to use consistently. Occasionally just gets thrown on whatever target, no matter what you're doing. You can aim for a head, shoot, make sure you shoot just right, and ends up on an arm. You could use the cleave process where some people, like if you just aim in the right spot while using the Esral Arts cleave, you still are using the Esral Arts cleave, or just using the, I can't remember the name of it exactly, but anyway, basically you would do the same thing twice and end up with a different result, which would be kind of annoying. I think that's not really Gunner's fault. I feel like that's more PSO2 than anything else, but it does affect Gunner in one of its main mechanics. So because of that, putting it behind Hunter in B tier. It does still do a lot of damage if you can maximize use of your chain triggers. Doesn't really have use as a subclass. Yes, that means people who are looking at playing things like Ranger Gunner, not really a thing, unfortunately. I mean, other than just kind of like, no, I'm not even gonna entertain it. It's just not a thing. Gunner really suffers from that. Now, granted, Gunners out there have hope. NGS fixes a lot of these issues, by the way. A lot of the problems I have with Chain Trigger are completely alleviated in NGS, so that's cool. Also, there was another thing I didn't mention about Gunner. Gunner also requires the use of a very specific sort of cancel to use its S-roll not reliably, but use its S-roll optimally. And that cancel is very kind of weird and jank. Granted, you can learn how to do it, and it actually is very powerful once you do. But the fact that that's not really built into the class, you have to learn how to do it differently, is kind of annoying. Basically, you cancel the third slow roll of your shot roll, and you just continuously get the first two over and over again, which are full speed. So that also kind of hurt its placement a little bit, in my opinion. So Force is kind of a difficult one to place, right? Because we have classes like Phantom now that exist. They do a lot of what Force does, just in a different way. So for me, Force is B tier. So why is Force really B tier? Well, Force does quite a bit of damage. Again, you'll find this to be the case for a lot of classes when set up correctly. But in reality, Force is a little bit more one-dimensional. Now, I will give Force a little bit more credit than when I did this on stream. Originally I said Force really only had 2 actual setups. Primarily, you would either go Force Etwal, or in some cases, very rarely, there are some people that want Force Phantom for like TA setups and things of that sort. Technically, Force Fighter was that same setup, but Phantom was just a little bit better at doing it. And again, this is more so towards TA setups. And then when Luster comes out, there's actually a Force Luster setup that's actually really strong too. So I didn't really give it enough credit at that point in time, but for me still, for a vast majority of people, you're really looking at one major difference between Force and then just playing Phantom instead, which primarily was the use of compound techs. That's really about it. Force still does a crazy amount of damage, and it's really good for short bursts of damage, considering Force really has a huge amounts of damage on its spells. It doesn't really have to work up towards anything. It can just pop its stuff and go. It is very stationary if you're playing something like Force Etwal, but it does do a lot of damage. So that's something to keep in mind. But it does make it very one-dimensional. You don't use it as a subclass at all. And I mean, for most people, they're just going to flock to Phantom in most cases, because unless you really, really, really want to be able to use compound techs, there's really not another like great reason to use force in a sense. Tekker. Well, Tekker's kind of a funny one because apparently I found out that Tekkers don't like playing Tekker, which is crazy to me. Well, to be fair, that's not exactly crazy. I mean, not everyone wants to play support all the time. I'm talking about you later, Etwal, but not everyone wants to play support all the time, so I can totally understand that. But as a class, Tekker gets A tier. So its buffs are insanely powerful. Even with having access to Skydance Boon, where we're able to buff ourselves every 10 seconds while in the air, Tekker still provides buffs that you want to maintain consistently if you can. Having one Tekker in a group can vastly increase your damage of the entire group overall. That and Tekker also does damage itself. When Luster releases, Tekker Luster is a very, very strong damage combination. Right now we have things like Tekker Phantom, Tekker Etwal, which still do really, really well, but Tekker Luster is pretty buff. In some cases, buffer than other combinations of classes that should technically be doing more damage than them, Etwal, in certain pieces of content. But that's something to keep in mind. I know a lot of Tekkers really aren't super happy with playing Tekker at the moment. It can be kind of annoying. You are required to keep a hold of a lot of things, and as is the case in most games where you have to play support, people tend to complain to you all the time, wanting you to do certain things, when in reality, you know, if you're doing things the correct way, no one should have anything to say anyway. So for that reason, Tekker gets moved in A for me, just because it's one of the supports that you'll always want no matter what. Braver. So Braver's pretty cool, actually. Braver is, I mean, it's kind of one-dimensional in its class choice. It's only ever going to be a main class. You're not really going to subclass Braver for anything right now. But Braver is actually one of the classes I recommend to most players as the most new player friendly class. So for that, I actually put Braver in A tier. I'm gonna put it behind Tekker, actually. So where do you put Braver in A tier? So Braver's main weapons are Katana and Bow. It has builds that work well for primarily Katana, primarily Bow, and both weapons. And they do each of those things very well. They're different styles of damage. And one of the cool things is that Braver also offers you a fairly easy to use tree itself. It's nothing too complicated to figure out, so it's nothing that feels like a trap there at all. Granted, I haven't really been using that as like a litmus for judging the other classes, but it's something to keep in mind for when I mention that it's really good for new player use, because you can't really screw up too many things. And it incentivizes certain types of play that players should really learn how to play, or really learn how to use, while also not punishing you too hard. Katana Braver's block feature, where you have the access to parry if you time it properly, but if you do it too early and just hold it, you have access to block, is probably one of the best mechanics I can find for a new player. Basically, I can say, hey, look, man, if you're still learning a fight, block early. Worst case scenario, you still get a block. Best case scenario, you get the parry and you get the proper timing. So either way, you're not dying. You take either severely reduced damage or no damage at all, while also dealing some damage back. That's super useful and super awesome. You also have access to a range weapon, where in some cases, certain classes only have access to melee or range. You have access to both, making it fairly useful. On top of that, Braver also benefits from using a dexterity mag, which I personally consider one of the most broken mags in the entire game for new players, primarily because it allows you to access gear very early on that you may not be able to access otherwise, and it's very powerful for Braver, especially for the Braver Phantom setup. So it just, all these things compound on top of each other to make Braver a really good class to pick up if you're first starting the game out, in my opinion. Granted, go with what you like, go with the weapon type you like, but if you had to pick a class and you're thinking to yourself, what is the best class for me to pick at the very beginning while I'm still trying to learn the game, I'm going to say Braver 9 times out of 10. Summoner. Well, you know what? We're going to put Bouncer here too, because these are the two classes I play the most, by the way, so I'm leaving these two here. Summoner. So Summoner is it's interesting to rank because Summoner really feels like it's playing its own video game most of the time. The pet system is very different than the weapon system in the game itself. Of course, units are used the same way, but it's just all about the pets. So what Summoner got working in its advantage? Well, access to pets, an insane amount of damage if you play it correctly. It was one of the best, or one of the second best subclasses in the entire game for a very long time before the silent classes came out, and still very usable. So where does that put Summoner for me? I'll be honest with you guys. Sorry, I had to put it right at the very beginning of A tier. Summoner is crazy powerful, and other than the fact that it's so disconnected from the game when it comes to everything else, it's got everything else in its advantage. It's very usable as a subclass. It's super useful for leveling other classes. That's kind of cool. I'll have to show that trick off later on, but it's super useful for leveling other subclasses as well. It's honestly fairly easy to play in certain ways. You can be a bit lazy with Summoner and still get out quite a bit of damage. And I mean, it has a really cool different mechanic. So it's just one of those situations where Summoner just does a lot of things really, really well. The only thing I can say is no one really cares about having a Summoner in their party. It's just you bring damage to the table and that's about it. But everywhere else, Summoner does really, really well. So for me, Summoner gets moved right up to A tier. Matchup dependence doesn't really matter. It has a pet usually for almost every situation. So pretty cool. Which brings me to my last two classes, Etwal and Bouncer. So we'll start with Bouncer. Bouncer is a class that I've mained for a very long time. I've played for years. I've played correctly. I've played incorrectly. I've done amazing things. I've done terrible things. And over all the time playing Bouncer, one thing I realized is it really hasn't had much love. Jet boots are very powerful. It's super awesome. But the support that Bouncer brings doesn't really matter. Especially now in the game itself, because what it brings as support, no one cares about. You have crit, which is useful, yes. It would have been more useful later on. We're gonna delete this really quick. We don't need a D-roll. But it brings crit, which is cool, but everyone who needs crit's gonna have it, or they're gonna have access to a tech card that's gonna bring them crit anyway. And it brings damage, which is decent, but it is extremely situational, requiring you to either be on elements, on a broken parts, having certain specific skills, having certain cooldowns up. Everything that's made Bouncer feel great has always been a band-aid fix from either another class or from a piece of gear. And for me, that brings Bouncer way down. I love the class. I'm not saying it's bad. I know a lot of my other Bouncer friends out there and be like, oh, I can't believe you put Bouncer in C tier. But for people who like legitimately played Bouncer, who've tried to optimize Bouncer as much as possible, they understand the growing pains of like needing certain S abilities, needing certain weapons, needing multiple weapons. Actually, it's funny enough, if you find a lot of solo players who play Bouncer, who do either solo TAs or do challenge runs, things of that sort, you'll find they have tons of weapons. A lot of these are to fill in the gaps where Bouncer tends to fall flat from other classes. That and its skill tree can be kind of a pain in the butt too. Sometimes they're just things all over the place. I mean, you have 2 full cooldowns that you have to invest into depending upon the weapons that you're using. If you're not using both weapons, you can really hurt yourself in certain pieces of content. There are too many caveats that really hurt Bouncer, in my opinion. That other classes like, say, Hero, Fighter, Braver get alleviated. I mean, Braver is kind of a little bit of a different one, since Braver does have like an entire cooldown that they have to invest into, but it's not really as intense as Bouncer's. I mean, it's around the same amount, but it's not, you know, super terrible. But Bouncer really has to invest into like an entire set, 2 stances pretty heavily, as well as 2 cooldowns to be optimal in every situation, which it just brings, and compared to everything else, granted, again, not bad, but compared to everything else in the game, it just brings it down that much lower for me. So as much as I love the class, as much as I've played it for long, to be fair, I love dual blades, not Bouncer, which is, it kind of terrible, feels bad to say, but I love dual blades, not necessarily Bouncer. Jet boots are cool. Jet boots are powerful. However, that's not what made the class for me originally. But what does Bouncer do well? Bouncer does some really decent damage, and in content that it excels in, it absolutely crushes in. When Luster comes out, it's going to make, you know, dual blades Bouncer super awesome. Phantom made playing Jet boots Bouncer substantially better, pushing out tons and tons of damage. And for that reason, it pushes it up pretty well, but it's just a lot of other things that are kind of working against it. It's kind of limited tree a little bit. I mean, these two, honestly, for me, are interchangeable. Between these two, I mean, like, put Bouncer at the end just as a bit of a meme, but between these two, they're kind of interchangeable. So where does that leave our boy Etwal? So those of you who know, I play Etwal currently as my main class on Global. I played it as JP as my main class too. Etwal has a lot of things going for it that are really nice. Etwal, as you know, is a very good subclass, provides unconditional damage bonuses to a lot of different class types, can make a lot of classes work fairly decently. Even if they're weaker versions of the classes, it's still pretty nice. What you'll hear when people say that Etwal is tanky is it has a skill called Damage Bouncer, Damage Balancer over on JP. Essentially what it means is that it takes 70%, or the character takes 70% reduced damage for the trade-off of all healing types are reduced to 1 HP healing ticks. unless you use a healing item. So because of that, you take severely reduced damage. However, your healing options are very, very limited. Now in content where your healing options already are limited, this is awesome. So say, for example, if you're doing something like Endless, where eventually the healing reduction gets to be very, very high, Etwal excels because you take severely reduced damage compared to every other class in the game, whether it be as a main or as a subclass. However, where Etwal falls flat, in my opinion, when it comes to the actual survivability or the tankiness, is as a main class, its will is one-time use, as opposed to Hero and Luster. I didn't talk about our Hero, but Hero has the ability to refresh its will. Granted, you have to play very well. Granted, you take a bit of a damage cut, not a substantial one, but you do take a little bit of a damage cut to refresh your will. But you do still have access to it, and you continuously keep going, as well as Luster being able to refresh their will every 500 voltage. Etwal only gets one refresh, and that's primarily because, of course, you have 7% damage reduction. That makes sense. But the thing about it is, you're also sacrificing overall damage compared to every other class and every other weapon that's being used. Etwal's damage is a fair bit lower than other Scion classes and just other base classes in general with some of the same weapons. I'm assuming most of that is because of its tankiness, but that tankiness can be farly over-exaggerated when you have classes like, for example, say Hunter Etwal, or almost any other class that subs Etwal that has access to all of its defensive options, while being able to alleviate the ability to heal sometimes with just, abilities in the class itself. For example, Hunter has access to automate. That means that they don't ever really have to stop to heal themselves, even though the Etwal only works with healing items for main items. So granted, you can use a ring to alleviate this a bit, but you do have to stop to heal yourself, which kind of sucks. And technically, because your defensive options are available as an all-class ability, it does mean that other classes that subclass use, and they're not going to need as many points as you do to get as much damage as possible, they're going to be just as tanky as you, if not more tanky. So it does feel a little bit bad in that situation itself, but where Etwal feels awesome, it feels amazing, is the fact that its weapons are super stylish. I love the weapon choices it has. Of course, I love dual blades, I love double saber. Super cool weapons. And it's much more forgiving when you're able to take chip damage and not outright die. However, you do need to leverage your defensive options for more damage, and if you play very well, you're not being rewarded at all. Unfortunately, at a high level, what you'll find is as much as you optimize, that much optimization can go into any of the other Scion classes and you'll just do better overall. And that sucks. So at a high level of optimization, Etwal falls flat. So where I put it is interchangeable. High B, low A. Just because as a subclass, it gets carried very, very heavily. It is really useful as a subclass for a lot of classes in the game. Where it gets hurt is it has to sacrifice damage just for all of those benefits. And the better you get at it, it almost feels sometimes like the less you're rewarded. Just like random little tidbits and notes from playing Etwal. I mean, double saber Etwal during very high speed, very very aggro heavy encounters feels to fall behind other weapons. Now dual blade does help with those specific encounters, which is super awesome, but those are my two favorite weapons and they tend to fall a little bit behind. Now granted, Wand Etwal is very strong. It can pump out quite a bit of damage, and it's kind of silly because it's probably Etwal's best weapon overall, so it should be considered here. It kind of makes me want to push Etwal. I mean, Etwal end of A tier I feel like is a bit more fair. This is me just being a little bit upset over the fact that, I want more damage so I can optimize better. But realistically, it's more like this. Etwal Wand is pretty unfair when it comes to its damage between the three weapons of Etwal, just because it's crazy defensive, it's crazy fast, it does a lot of damage. Its really only issue is that it needs a lot of PP to be like super efficient, and it can be mitigated pretty heavily by just your gear choices, as well as a few S-grade augments. So that's really about it. So there you have it. You've got my tier list. This is what I think of all the classes in the game. Now granted, remember, this is what I think of the classes in the game. This is no way in shape and form the exact tier list of how strong classes are, how weak classes are. Everyone's got their own opinion. By all means, feel free to take the link that I'm going to put in the video description, make your own tier list, enjoy it. But the cool thing is every class in this game is very much playable, it's very much usable. As much as I dump on Etwal, I mean, I do love the weapons that it actually gets to use, and I have completed every piece of content in the game. Outside of doing Endless just yet, even though it's kind of funny, I said Etwal's great at Endless. I haven't done Endless just yet. But and I've been able to do it fairly well. Other content, not endless. I'm kind of going on a rant at this point, so I should probably end the video here. Anyway, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to toss them in the comments below. As always, a like on the video is much appreciated and absolves you of half your ad block guilt. The other half is absolved by subscribing. Both are completely free and help me out a ton. If you guys want to keep up with the content, make sure to click on the bell icon to be notified of videos as they go live, as well as community posts, or you can join us over on Discord or follow me over on Twitter for notifications in one of those areas, or just how you can communicate and interact with me. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Peace out.